Hello, I'm Joe Holloway, and welcome to Eastern Shore Veterans, their story, their honor. Today we're meeting with three family members, and we're going to talk about how military service has affected their family. Their story is one of pride and sacrifice, and the impact it has made on their lives. First guest is Belva Dennis from Snow Hill, Maryland, and Abby Mason from Newark, Delaware, and Rhonda Dykes from Snow Hill, Maryland. Good afternoon. How are you all doing today?
We're doing fine.
Good. Well, first, before we start, because sometimes we run out of time, I want to thank you all for your time to come in today.
It's our pleasure.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Okay.
We're usually asked to not talk, so this is great.
Okay. Rhonda, let's start with you.
Okay.
Let's start with growing up in Snow Hill. Tell us a little bit about your family and where it all started.
Okay. Our mother and father got married before the war, and like a lot of post-war couples, when they first returned, they didn't really have means to begin, so they moved in with her parents in Powellville. My mother was from Powellville, a good Powellville girl. And so their two sons were born in Powellville at the farm where my mother grew up. They were able to get together enough money to buy a small lot in Snow Hill, and my father built the house that we were raised in. So eventually there were 5 children in 9 years, and my father was a master carpenter who worked with his father. And my mother, with 5 children, was a stay-at-home mom at the time. I can't imagine what she would have done with us all. So it was a wonderful childhood. We had very loving, caring parents and a very strong, extended family. That was our primary social life, was getting together with families on the with our family on the weekends. Every Saturday night, 20 people were at our house. Every Sunday, 20 people were at a cousin's house. So we enjoyed that type of a thing, and visiting the farm with my mother, and just having most of our activities centered around family. So we had, I would say, a very close family.
Mm-hmm. Well, things were different back in the '60s than they are now. I mean, a lot of visitations back and forth between families.
Right.
You know, it seems that we've gotten away from that a little bit over time. 5 kids.
5 kids in 9 years.
In 9 years. Yeah, and then they
right.
bought a TV.
And then that was much later.
Yeah. So
yeah, we actually we had a wonderful neighbor, and she would allow us, all 5 of us, to go over to her house every Friday evening, and we would go over there and watch Rawhide.
Yeah.
So because we did not have a television.
I remember having to do something like that.
Yeah.
Now that, of course, all came after World War II, of course.
Yes.
And your dad and mom both had some service. Bella, tell us a little bit about your dad's service in World War II.
Okay. Daddy was registered with the Selective Service in 1942. And they weren't quite sure if they really were going to ever be able to enlist him in the Army Air Force. That was his choice, because he was blind in his right eye, had super duper flat feet, and so they said, well, you'll never be a foot soldier. There's something that we can do, but it won't be a foot soldier. So, of course, they sent him to Florida and taught him to be a drill instructor. And then from that, he went to England and was in the regular Army Air Force at the time. And then, of course, eventually ended up in the waters off of Normandy Beach in France in, 1944? Yes, in 1944. And so he was riding the water all day long in one of the little landing craft boats on D-Day. And the lieutenant boarded their boat at the end of the day. And he said, boys, he said, you're supposed to be the last boat in today. He said, but I don't have the heart to send you after what's happened. So he said, but you will be the first boat in tomorrow morning. So the next morning, they were the first boat to land on Normandy, and their instructions were, do not look down, only look up. Things are a mess on the beach. And of course, once they landed, you have to look down because you're stepping on other people's bodies, and then you've got the lieutenant at your back screaming and hollering, "Don't look down, look up, look up." So then they all just react, and they looked up and did what had to be done for the rest of that day. And so, I mean, that's everything in short form.
Yeah.
And, Rhonda Abbey, I'm sure, might have more to add to that.
Well, I got one question you were talking about. There was a great urgency among the young men at World War II to join.
Absolutely.
I mean, everybody wanted to be in the military back
Yes.
then. Now, I see on the table here we have a little piece of metal.
Yeah, I forgot to tell you
Pretty
that.
innocent looking piece of metal, but can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, in 1944 in France, he was a foot soldier. He walked across France, and but on this particular day, he was sitting on a piece of equipment. I don't know whether it was a bulldozer or whatever, because they went in and made roads and air landing strips for the wave that would come behind them. And he said it was a beautiful sunny day, and they were all had their engines cut off, and they were just sitting back relaxed, had their hands behind their head, and they heard planes coming. And he said, we all just rocked back and looked up, and we said, well, here comes our boys. And all of a sudden, bombs started dropping. So they each dove off of the piece of equipment that they were sitting on and dove under the next piece of equipment until the planes finished dropping their bombs. And then the sergeant hollered out, is anybody hurt? And Daddy said, I think I am. And they're like, you think you are, Gordy? Well, are you hurt or not? And he's like, I think I am. So he was face down, and they pulled him out by his feet. And that's the largest chunk of shrapnel they got out of his back. And then he had to go to a field hospital, and they pulled some more shrapnel out of him. But basically, he carried it with him for the rest of his life.
Some of it was
It was
left in him.
lodged on the inside
Yeah.
of his right rib cage.
Mm-hmm. I see. Abby, anything to add to that story?
Just a couple things. He was with what was called the In-Transit Depot group, and their mission on D-Day was to go in and then dump the equipment and then load them onto convoy trucks and get inland as fast as possible to build the airstrips. And he received commendation for the action of their group because, as Belvis, it was war. He was not supposed to ever shoot a gun. And on the beach, he met an officer and he gave them guns. And they said, we're not supposed to carry them. He said, well, you are. And they went, he led them, and they actually took out one of the pillboxes where the Germans were on the beach. And so life, he shared with us oftentimes about what life was like in the camp. So they took care of having supply places for fuel for the airplanes and building the landing strips. And life there was interesting in France. He talks about getting a boar, and they'd cook it up and get some local tomatoes and some French bread and eat that. And the camp's name was Skunk Hollow. That was one of the some of their tents that they named that, and I think that might have been because of those onions that they put on their sandwiches. And taking a bath in a helmet, and of course the weather was nice sometimes, but it was also very snowy and cold at other times. But here's a little Snow Hill boy who gets to see Paris.
Yeah. Was there ever any? Did he ever tell any stories about the interaction with the French people?
He didn't tell stories, but we have some photographs of them interacting, mostly, I think, with people in Normandy. At one time, it looked like they were trading something they had for something that an elderly woman had. They certainly, from the photos, we see that they certainly knew where to buy local wine. So, but I don't think, any stories. We have a photo, one that I really like, which is in Paris. There's an elderly French man in a top hat, and he is saluting the Americans.
as they're coming into town.
Yes, as they're coming into town,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
good.
Was Mr. Gordy reluctant to talk about the war?
I remember probably the earliest time that I think that he talked to either one of us about the war was, I can't remember how old I was, maybe a young teen. And I walked into the living room and he was talking to my two older brothers, Mike and Denny, and they were on the floor and he had some pictures and he asked me to leave. So he said, I don't want, you need to go into the other room. I'm talking to Mike and Denny. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He says, I'm talking about war, honey. So he was, we found out later, was relaying to our brothers, and he had some pictures of the concentration camps. We still have those. I don't know how he, got those, if he was part of, that part of the war effort or not. But I think that it was a heartfelt conversation on his part. I think he wanted his boys to not have an idealized version of what war was like. I think he wanted them to know what it was really like. And then I think later, I left home right after high school, but I think he had many conversations later, particularly whenever Belva started questioning. As you get older, you start thinking about those things a little more. And I think that later he did speak about it and would speak it around all three of us. I guess he felt like we were old enough to be able to handle it then, but we were probably in our late 20s by the time he started talking about it more.
And I know one of the things that he told Mike and Denny was all the planning in the world, when it comes down to it, it's chaos. War is chaos.
Yeah,
and you need to take care of yourself.
Yeah. Well, now I want to talk about this wonderful lady that I had the chance to meet a few years ago named Pauline Gordy. And Abby, tell us a little bit how your mom and dad met, and then if you would go into about her service during World War II.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Mom, as Rhonda said, grew up on a farm in Powellville, Maryland. During the Depression. She was the youngest daughter of a large family of 7, close family, godly family. Church life was very important to them. Social life was very important to them. Of course, Snow Hill and Powellville, you're related to pretty much everybody that you see if you just take a minute to go back a few generations and find out how you're connected. She worked hard, had an amazing, strong work ethic, was amazingly strong. By the time she was 5 or 6, they had cut a hoe off for a short handle, and she was out in the fields working, and she worked hard all her life. But she also loved to have a good time. At the times when she could get away, she loved having a good time, and she was so determined to have a good time that she and a friend would roller skate from Powellville to Snow Hill, 12 miles, to see the guys in town, which for Mom turned out to be my father, Edward Gordy, and didn't have to worry about roller skating back because they would always get a ride back.
Yeah.
And so those are the main things that I remember. She loved life. She was a joyful person and a kind person, and she thought Powellville was the best place in the whole world.
Now, did they get married before the war? Mom and Dad?
They were dating before the war, and jitterbugging down at Public Landing, and I think the social life then was so much better. If somebody would have a car, and those cars were huge, and you'd load up a whole group and go over to Ocean City or go to Public Landing. And so they met at someone's birthday party, and they spun the bottle, and they ended up kissing. And Mom wasn't real impressed at that time, but Dad kept after her, and eventually he won her heart. So when it came time for Daddy to enlist, they had been dating for probably 3 years. But so he enlists in 1943, and just before he enlisted, she went down to Newport News. She had a brother and his wife who were living there. Her brother was working in the shipyard. They had this little one-bedroom house, and she and a girlfriend went down there and slept on the pull-out couch, or when somebody else would come, in the bathtub. And they looked for jobs, and they found a job as crane operators at the shipyard. Electric crane operators. And so they would climb up 80 feet every day to get in the electric crane. Of course, Newport News was full of soldiers, and so they had hand signals that they could flirt with the soldiers down on the floor with. She had a blast there. She was, fun-loving, very social person. They would go, if they stayed in town on weekends, they'd go to Buckrow Beach, and there would be even more soldiers there that they could flirt with. And then they'd take the train back when they needed to come home, take the train to Salisbury. She came back home, and then Daddy was, of course, they were corresponding, and he was working on her to get her to marry him. And he had a 5-day leave in September of 1943, and the first 3 days they argued about whether or not to get married. And then she finally relented because she knew he was going to be shipped overseas, and she just didn't know whether she wanted to take on being married and not being married.
Right.
But he won her over, and so they got married and then had 2 days together. Then he had some more training and shipped out after that.
Bella, would you like to? I know she missed something.
Yeah. When Mommy was 11, one of her older brothers came home with an African American child who was being given up by his family because they could no longer feed him because it was during the Depression. And his name was Harold, and Harold lived on the farm in Powellville in the house with the family and became part of the family. And Mommy and Daddy, when Mom went to Newport News, Harold had asked our grandfather if it would be all right with him if he joined the military. And our grandfather told him that he needed to do whatever was best for him and that he certainly had no ties to the farm. Go out and do whatever it is you need to do and make yourself successful. So Harold joined the military. So Mommy's in her coveralls with her lace hanky in her pocket, and the girls that worked on the cranes and Rosie Riveters, they would roll the hem of their coveralls up a little bit to show a lace anklet sock, trying to be a little bit feminine in a masculine outfit. And she had to stop to cross the street, and she saw the black convoy coming through town because, of course, everything was very segregated back then. And she said, "Oh, I wonder if there's any chance that I could get so lucky to see Harold." So she's standing there watching truck after truck after truck go by, and all of a sudden she heard her name being called, and it was Harold. He was hollering, "Pauline, Pauline, Pauline." And so the last time they saw each other was her standing on the sidewalk waving goodbye to him in the convoy truck leaving Newport News. And they never saw each other again because Harold didn't return to the Eastern Shore until they were both in their late 80s.
Is that right?
And Mommy's brother found Harold living in Philadelphia, so the three went up for a visit with him.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so
after
that
all
was-
those years. Yeah,
That was a
yeah.
unique little
Yeah.
story, yeah.
And give us your perspective on Mom and her service down in Newport News.
Oh, she just talked about it as being fun, and
Yeah.
she was a fun-loving
Yeah.
person, and I think it was just a interim period for her where maybe she could see that she was going to get married and she was going to have that last bit of fun and everything. She said she behaved, though, so I guess I have to take her at her word.
That's right.
Well, there's a sense of duty that,
Yeah.
that
Oh,
I
yeah.
think all Americans had back then, and that
I
was
think
part of it.
that
And-
the war effort, especially as the war that we remember, of course, is Vietnam because we lived through that. But when we've often compared it to what our parents had talked about and their generation, it was so different because, like you said, Joe, everyone was involved in the war effort. There was such support, and I'm sure that the soldiers felt that, the whole country felt it, and so I think Mom felt it. I think she felt like she was doing her part.
Yeah. Your mother's story was quite interesting. Young girl traveling to Newport News, working on a crane, during the war effort. How did that affect you guys? Do you think it affected you? You weren't born yet, of course, but that work ethic, you grew up around that, your dad's work ethic. How did that affect you all through your life?
Well, we were, as our mother was aging and everything, we were figuring out ways to keep her in her own home and to provide for her, between the three of us and so on and so forth. And we just never, ever thought once about tapping into any resources that she was absolutely eligible for, and we laugh about it now because it was just something that never crossed our mind. You have to take care of your own people, and you've got to, you're going to sacrifice and certainly honor her in every way that we could in trying to help her maintain her independence and everything. And so I just thought that was humorous. Later I said, oh my gosh, she was eligible for everything.
Yeah. And Abby, you all, I guess I should disclose this. I didn't in the beginning, but I'm married to your cousin, so I know a little bit about your family, and but you've all been hardworking people, the whole family, and I think that's something that came along, the work ethic.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that we received a really great inheritance in work ethic from both of our parents. I think our dad was one of the hardest working men we have ever known. And then Mom, not only the Newport News thing, but she drove trucks to Only's, taking tomatoes into Only's, drove a school bus, and worked, kept a chicken house, and they bought their first car after the war with that money. But I really feel like the one of us who really did some independent and different things is Belva in the family. And so I'd like to turn that over to her about.
What do you mean?
Well,
different.
there weren't very many women house painters.
Oh, that's
that
true.
I knew of.
Yeah, well, she introduced me to my wife. That's one
Yes.
thing
I
she did.
did. I
So-
did.
And so I think she got from she shared Daddy's blind eye,
Yes.
and I think that he took special efforts then to let her know that she could do anything that she put her mind to do, and I think she has done that.
Yeah.
The house painting that she took on and did, and she's a very physically strong woman, and she has tackled many projects requiring a lot of strength. She runs her own house cleaning business and works very, very hard physically. And so I really see in her that really both of them, that combination of, they both my mother and father loved physical activity and physical work. And I really see that exemplified in the things that Belva has taken on.
Well, thank you, Abby.
I seen her with her arms around the governor here a few weeks ago.
Yes,
Yeah.
I did schmooze with the governor. Yeah, Mom, at 86, she was still pushing the trim mower in her yard. I was mowing the lawn. And so I made up my mind I wasn't going to start the mower for her anymore. She had gotten to the point where she couldn't pull the rope and start the mower. So she knows I like to cut nice, straight lines, and I don't like them to be messed up. And so I've gone down one row, turned around, and she's standing in the middle of my row that I'm now making with that push mower. And I went, no, Mom, no. So I go back, turn around again, she's in that row. So finally I had to cut the mower off. And I said, Mom, I'm not going to start the push mower for you. Why not? And I said, because you're 86 years old, you had 5 kids, and I don't think you should ever have to cut grass again as long as you live. And she was so upset that I wouldn't pull the rope on that mower because she did not know what to do while I was working and she couldn't. I said, please go sit in that swing and just watch me. And when I get over to the swing, you can get out and move it out of my way. But she saw, I would believe, through me, she still felt like she could work.
Yeah.
It's like if I sit here and watch her, it's like I'm still doing it. So she did up until her last year. She really did try to be the woman she always had been, and age just said, nope, it's time to stop.
So they get back from the war Edward and Pauline, and they're married. And now the babies start coming along.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Mike and Denny were the oldest.
Yeah, Mike was
They
the
were
oldest,
two boys.
and then Denny followed in about a year and a half, about 18 months later. Denny, and then.
So
was
you're the
first-
oldest here.
Yeah, I'm the
okay.
oldest here. Yeah, yeah. So and then we're all 2 years apart.
Yeah.
So
2 years. 2 years
yes,
apart. Okay.
yeah.
We've had, a lot of fun with this conversation so far. So we're going to have to get a little more serious now. The boys,
Yeah.
Came time for them to serve, and they both entered the military at some point in time. I guess before we go too far, was there any reluctance with your father? Do you remember of anybody saying they had a conversation with the boys about, is this good? Is this a good thing to do, or is this something we shouldn't do? Or do you remember anybody remember any of that kind of?
I will just start off. I think that our father left it up to. I think Mike and Denny made as much as you can at that age, made independent decisions. I don't think there was any expectation or push, particularly from my father. The only thing is he had great regret that Mike had joined the Marines.
Oh yeah,
He was
being an
very
Army guy, yeah.
fearful
that-
that as a Marine that Mike might be more in harm's way than if he had
Right.
joined another
Yeah.
thing. So even in all the talks that he had had with his boys, I think that he accepted it. And as a young man in Snow Hill, without a lot of financial resources, I think a lot of young men across the country at that time. Part of it was, you do, the expectation is that, most of their fathers had served the country and that they would as well. But also, I think, there were some economical reasons.
Right.
What are you going to do now? I just graduated from high school. I don't have enough money to go to college. What do I do
Right.
on my road to become a man?
Right.
And so I think that some of those issues were in there, but I don't remember any pressure from my mother or father concerning that.
Either joining or not joining,
Yes.
something like
Yeah,
that.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. Well, Rhonda, we'll talk about Mike. Mike was the oldest boy, and he
Right.
joined the Marines.
Yes.
And what year was that?
He joined in 66,
66.
1966,
So,
right.
and If you want to start.
Okay.
Doing,
So Mike was in the Marine Corps, and we were able as a family to go and visit him when he graduated from basic training. That was a really big event. And then eventually, Mike ended up in Vietnam, and he was always stationed on the DMZ somewhere. So he was always in where most of the action was was taking place. His with the 3rd Marines. So during his first tour, he was wounded. And he was wounded in the stomach area and the upper leg from a mortar shell. And so he was taken to a field hospital first. We got a telegram before Thanksgiving. I remember it was before Thanksgiving of 67 or 68. I'm not sure. 67, I think. And saying that he had been wounded, and then of course we're just waiting by the phone to find out, what his circumstances were. He was put in a field hospital, and eventually they sent him from the field hospital to Japan, to Yokosuka. They had a naval hospital there, and he was sent there for more therapy and more operations. And so just a little aside, while he was there, one of his best friends from Snow Hill, Kenny Pettit, I believe, was stationed there or was there for some reason, came to see him, and a girl that he had gone through school with, Joan McGee, and her husband were also there. And Joan was a nurse there at the hospital, and they stopped in to see him. So, just
Small world.
Yeah.
halfway around the world,
Yeah.
more than that,
Yeah.
2 of your classmates show up, and just how wonderful to recognize their service as well, but just also that he was able to see someone from home. So we had that happened. Of course, that was very, very concerning. And then Mike extended his tour. He came home after his first year. I think it was 13 months. And then didn't want to let us know until very short to the time that he was leaving that he had extended a tour and was going back for a second tour in Vietnam. The second tours didn't last as long. I'm not sure if it was for 6 months or something like that, but it was for a shorter period of time than the first one.
Did he have a reason for extending? Did he give the family a reason for extending? Or
You know, I just think by that point, Mike just had, I don't think Mike had any illusions about the war anymore by that point. We could tell from his letters that the reason that he went there was not the reason that he stayed there. Meaning that he didn't feel anymore towards the end that he was fighting for America. He felt like that his reason for being there was for the Vietnamese people because they were being so mistreated by the NVA, by the North Vietnamese. And he just had such a heart for the people. And I think that, part of Mike's personality was just about, if there's an injustice somewhere, I want to be there trying to fix things. So I think that's why he may have gone back. There could have been some other personal disappointments that happened that could have been reasons. I'm not really sure all of the things that went into that, but he made a decision to go back.
I guess at some point in time you received word that
Right, and that was just really, we're all 2 years apart, but I think Abby was 8th grade, Belva was 10th, and I was 12th grade. I was a senior in high school, and I was home from school one day. And it was after lunch, I think, and so I was the only one at home. My mother was working at Aztec National Seashore. My father was working at a carpentry job in town. I got a phone call from the Baltimore Sun, and they were asking me questions concerning Mike in the past tense. And it was very difficult for me to understand. I was going, it was kind of confusing to me at the time. I didn't understand what they were saying. She said, "How old was your brother?" And I heard that was. And so we had not been notified. Meanwhile, at the same time that I was getting the phone call from the Baltimore Sun, our father was having a coffee break at the Round Table in Snow Hill, which was a eating establishment where men gathered in the afternoon to have a cup of coffee in between work. And it had large plate glass windows. And he saw a military car come up to the stoplight. There was right at the stoplight in Snow Hill, and he looked at it, and he says to himself, "If it turns left, he's going to my house." And when the guy turned left, Daddy excused himself and said, "Gentlemen, I need to go home." And so he followed the military car up our lane. And that was shortly after I had received the phone calls and was just, very distraught. And he came in the house and had a short conversation with the military people. He was embarrassed later in saying, I don't know why I asked him that, but he said, "Which one are you here for?" Because both of our brothers were in Vietnam at the same time. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." He said, "I didn't realize you're with the Navy or the Marines or whatever." So our other brother was in the Air Force. So my father said, you let Abby and Belva be getting off the school bus soon, and I have to go get your mother. So he left for Assateague, and then I met Abby and Belva to let them know.
What was your first thoughts?
I think denial. We'd never had any kind of that sort of trauma before, and just that it was impossible. This could not happen. This was impossible. And just stunned, shocked. I'm sure I was in shock.
You were very young.
13.
13,
And I was 15.
Yeah.
And pretty much what Abby said, stunned and shocked, not settling in, and wondering what in the world was going to happen when Daddy brought Mommy home.
Now, we were talking about Snow Hill and the small town. There's not a lot of people from Snow Hill in the military at the time. I'm sure it was shocking to the whole town, and you all were very involved with the church. I suppose there was a lot of support from the church and the community.
I think our parents felt very supported. There was great outpouring. Snow Hill's a small town, 2,500, and they were involved and well-liked, well-loved, and so there was an amazing amount of support for them. Of course, our little house was just overflowing with fried chicken and platters, of food and people.
Things people do,
Yes. For us, there really wasn't support. Today, there would be counseling in schools. There really wasn't anything, and so we were out of school for 2 weeks, and then we just were told to go back. And so it was quite isolating. And so even though there was a lot of support, Mike was only one of 5 men in Worcester County who were killed in combat in Vietnam. Compare that to World War II, where there were 32 men killed in combat from Worcester County. And so it was a very isolating experience for us. We didn't have any friends that had anything like this experience. And so, yeah, it was wonderful support, and then also lacking in support.
Yeah, yeah. Now we've talked about Mike and Denny. Denny they were 2 years, were they 2 years apart?
Yes, well, a little less than 2 years.
Okay, okay, and he was in the military also.
Denny was 2 years younger than Mike. Mike was idealistic, passionate. He was either on top of the world or in the pits. Denny's personality was different. He was handsome and funny and intelligent, but he didn't really advertise what he was getting up to. He kind of kept it to the side. But he also was very committed, as Mike was, to going over and serving. And he joined the Air Force. Actually, I think he was in the reserves before he graduated high school, and then immediately went into that. His experience was very different. Training after training course. He got trained in radio communications, and also parachuting. That was his big love. That was his big training. So he goes into the war at the end of July in 1968. He ships out to Vietnam. Starts in Da Nang and then goes to Quang Ngai for most of the time. It was a frustrating experience for him in the war because he felt he was never allowed to do what he was trained for, which was to parachute. And so he was always in tension with the commanding officers, trying to get them to let him do what he was trained to do. He ended up doing a lot of work with radio communication with airstrikes. He really felt that responsibility because what he did in those communications and would mean whether or not people died or whether they were rescued. So that weighed heavily on him. But he wanted to be doing what he was trained for in that. And he had to sign a waiver for him to serve in Vietnam because you didn't have to. If one member of the family was already there, you didn't have to do that. He gladly did that. Mike had a fit, said he would make sure that Denny would, not do that, but he couldn't stop him any more than we could stop Mike from doing what he was doing. So then when Mike was killed, they made him return to the States, and that was one of the cruel ironies, was that after he was brought home to get out of harm's way in the war, but then a year and a couple months after Mike had been killed, Denny was killed by a drunk driver while he was still in service. So that was just a compounding of grief, obviously, for our family.
Right. Belva, did Mike and Denny have any interaction in Vietnam when they were both there together? Did you remember?
No, that was the sad part. They tried so hard to meet up with each other. And every time Denny could get to Da Nang, Mike couldn't. Anytime Mike could get to Da Nang, Denny couldn't. And so it was so sad because they really wanted to see each other because they hadn't seen each other for well over a year. Could have been possibly 2, being in separate branches of service. So that was that. But it isn't because they didn't try, because they tried very, very hard to do that. And also, when a person dies on foreign soil, as with Mike, you always have to fly the casket home with a military escort. And Denny chose to be his own brother's military escort. So he flew on the plane all the way to Dover.
That's Dover, Delaware.
Yeah,
Yes.
Dover, Delaware, with Mike's body. And then he was to call us so that Daddy could go and pick him up. But he had a lot of thinking to do, he said. So instead of calling us, he walked for miles and miles and miles and miles. And when he got home, he was still in the fatigues he had on from Vietnam. And he asked me if I could help him get his boots off, which I did. And he still had mud from Vietnam in his boots.
So did he go back in the service after that? Did he stay in the service?
Denny, yes,
Yeah.
he stayed in, and
Okay.
they stationed him in Panama City, Florida,
Uh-huh.
at Eglin Air Force Base.
see.
He was a Blue Beret.
Okay. Okay, and then that's when the accident happened
Right.
down there.
Yes.
Would you like to relate to that a little bit, or to Denny? You haven't talked about Denny much yet,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, Denny was just, I think Abby said, you never really knew who he was until he got out of high school. And then, just the thought of Denny jumping out of airplanes, it was like, he's doing that? So there was a whole side that he found about himself that was pretty exciting. But he was just a steadfast person, and he was a rock for our parents, I think. He became more than just the surviving son. He also, wanted to be sure that they were going to be okay, but yet, unfortunately, he didn't have enough time to do too much that he wanted to do, because his life was going to be very short as well. But he had a very close relationship with his mother and father, and was very open. He also had attained a certain, maybe cynicism, you'd want to call it, about the war. And I know one of the letters that he wrote to our parents, he said something like, well, the war's been going on for 8 years now. Who knew that rice was such a great commodity,
Okay.
And so I think that happened to many soldiers that I've spoken with, that they really, after a while, it's not about, fighting for America anymore. It's about saving the guy next to you, or maybe something even as far as caring about the people in the country. So.
How were you all notified about Denny?
Well, it was odd, because our mother had not been able to return to work after Mike's death. She was, having difficulty. Of course, our father did as well, but he did return because he had 3 children still dependent on him. And so I had come home. I had moved to Washington, D.C. right after graduation from high school, and I was home to celebrate my 19th birthday. And a family tradition since we were babies was that every Sunday we went to Assateague. We traveled there when it was a dirt road, before it became, the Assateague that we know now,
dating
very
yourself,
developed. Yeah. And so we were out in the water, the 3 of us were out pretty far, and we look up, and our father is, calling us, and he's waving us in. And so it was just very confusing. The park rangers remembered my mother from working there. Somehow Snow Hill once again came through, said, you know what, if you need Ed and Pauline on a Sunday, they're at the beach. And that's how they were notified that Denny had been in a terrible car accident, that 2 had been decapitated. There were 4 in the car. 2 had been decapitated. The young woman up front had been thrown out of the car, and Denny was in a coma in Florida. So by the time we got home to Snow Hill, this is before ATMs. This is 1970. This is before ATMs, and I don't even know if filling stations were still open on Sundays then in Snow Hill. There were people there at our house with transportation to BWI for our parents and cash money.
About that.
And so just as soon as we got home and they could change, they flew to Florida to be with Denny. He never regained consciousness. He had a closed head trauma. So they stayed with him and prayed with him. And he lived for a week. He died a week later. So in a year's time, a little over a year's time, they had lost both of their sons.
That's hard to even imagine.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, it's you read about things like that occasionally, but it's hard to even imagine. So.
Right. And they
Well,
were
God bless them. They had
they were
something to go through.
spectacular people. They did, and they really, sometimes when you have crisis, huge events like that, I've seen it have the opposite effect, where it drives people apart. The loss of a child, and certainly the loss of 2. Sometimes it causes separation, but our parents were able to hang together. And I think, Abby, you remembered one of the things that after Denny had died, we had an aunt. Did you want to say about that?
Well, sure. mom's sister-in-law. She had a sister-in-law, a really wonderful person, and this was not said out of any unkindness. And her heartbreak had been that she and her husband could never have children. And she was talking to Mom in the early days of getting the news into grief, and saying that she'd always wished that they had had children, but after seeing this, she didn't know that it would have been worth it. And my mother just was able to look at her and say, oh, it was so worth it.
Mm-hmm.
We had them for 22 years, and we loved them, and they loved us, and it was worth it. And she had an amazing faith to say that. There were times where people would ask her, are you bitter? And she said, bitter toward God in particular. And she said, no, never occurred to us to be bitter toward God. You know, and she had such a strong faith. She kept a prayer journal, and as we went over that after her death, many times she would express honestly how much she missed her boys, but that because of what Jesus Christ did on the cruel cross, she knew she would see them again. And that had such an impact, I think, on all of us watching. And my father's faith deepened over the years, and that had such an impact watching them with, you know, there was the Vietnam War, and then there was the Faith Under Fire War that our family walked through, and to see them walk through and to maintain joy and to maintain their faith in God, I think impacted all of us.
I think that lady probably couldn't imagine the pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, really.
Yeah.
Agreed.
She couldn't imagine the pain that
Yeah.
Pauline was going through.
Yeah.
So anyway, you know, as painful and as sad as it is, that what happened, life goes on.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
And
So.
Joe, one of the things that happened during the course of events was we, from a very early point, we tried to find out more details about Mike's death, Mike, the one that was killed in Vietnam. And because, you know, it was like they send you this letter. The letter is very, you know, it's a form letter. It felt like it. And
Very
then
impersonal.
you don't
Yeah.
really know what happened. And there's a desire, at least there was on my part, you know, a desire to know. And so we started an inquest then. And 30 years after the original inquest in 1969, we found out that Mike was killed by friendly fire.
It took 30 years.
Took 30 years to find that out.
Yeah.
And we have what we believe is a good source, a person who was there that night, and that most of what he says we believe is true. But before we met that person, we were, I guess,
Approached.
victims of stolen valor. I don't know if you've heard
Yeah,
about
I've heard
that.
yeah.
There was a gentleman who came unannounced to my mother's door, said that he had been with Mike the night he died, and was he was from Alabama, and he returned several times until finally we asked him not to come anymore. Because the more he talked, the more we knew that there were too many discrepancies in his story.
What was he looking for? He wasn't looking for money.
I think he was, you know, my mother was a very, you know, wonderful person to be around. You know, she was just a very,
I mean, was
just
he?
made everybody feel good.
Yeah, but I mean.
And I think he was looking for that. He was looking to be the hero of a
Oh, okay,
story.
okay,
So
okay.
he was the hero in the story
I
about
see.
Mike's death
I see.
instead
I
of
see.
it just being a
So he
horrible
wasn't
mess up
coming to
that
try
night.
to stay with somebody or look for a place to be? Or,
No.
Yeah,
He was
okay,
married.
okay.
He had a family.
Uh-huh.
Everything. I know that I think Belva was tasked with having to get him back and forth to the airport. He would not be truthful about when his flight was leaving. Flights were missed. You know, all sorts of things.
Yeah,
So once he got there, he kind of wanted to stay. You know, he
Right,
wasn't
right.
working, so he had time on his hands. But I think it was to be the hero of a story,
see.
and so we had to, you know, eventually stop communication because it was becoming really painful. You know, once we realized what had happened. So, you know, and I think. One of the things that has happened, you know, since then is that, or even the year after Mike's death, before Denny was killed in the car accident, my mother began this thing where you don't pretend it didn't happen, but you try to channel it in another way. And so we started looking. There were just a series of things that our family was involved in that was somehow trying to complete the legacy, that Mike and Denny had started concerning, their feelings about Vietnamese people. And so my mother had a foreign exchange student in her home from Vietnam for about a week. She had done her year with another family out of the area, and they were just traveling in the U.S. Before they were returning to Vietnam. We helped sponsor a Vietnamese family to Snow Hill. Very, very active in that, helping them find a house and jobs. And Belva taught them how to drive vehicles and get their license and just all sorts of things like that. And continues into things that we all three still do today that we didn't even realize were a continuation of, trying to remember their great sacrifice and continue it somehow.
What we were saying, the tragedy, the tragedies, I guess, that happen, and like you were saying, you try to move on as normal as you can after it's all over with. I understand 2 of you were married to Vietnam vets, and Belva and Rhonda.
Right.
Theirs is another story that we'll talk about later some other time, but there was a lot that went on after Vietnam, and Belva, would you like to touch on some of the things that the family was involved in?
Sure. Well, speaking about my husband, OB had worked for Dad for a summer before he went overseas, or joined the Army and then went overseas. And so Mike from Vietnam was sending Daddy home money to buy him tools because he intended to be a carpenter with his father when he returned to Snow Hill. And of course that did not happen. And so OB gets out in '69. His tour is done, and he came and asked my father if he could get his job back. And of course Dad was thrilled because he had so many hopes and dreams that Mike would have joined him in the family business. And all of those dreams went out the window with Mike's death. And so Daddy was very happy to have a young, strong man that could work with him every day. And he tried to get OB to join the Legion, but OB wasn't interested in it at all. But I went ahead and joined the auxiliary through my dad's records. And so we've always been very involved in the American Legion at Snow Hill. And when our father passed away, a contingency of the members came to Mommy and said, Mrs. Gordy, we would like to honor Ed by changing the post name from Worcester Post 67 to the L. Edward Gordy Memorial Post home. And she thought for about a second, and then she said, boys, she said, what an honor. She said, how happy he would be to think that you boys would want to change the post name in honor of him. And she said, but I knew Daddy pretty well. And she said, it'd be a lot of pressure on us as a family. So let's just leave it Worcester Post 67, because Worcester Post 67 says everybody. And so we have been very active in the Legion and still am today. And because we work there every Friday night for free, it costs me about $50 a week to work for free. And our tips go to sponsor the Marine Corps Junior ROTC out at Snow Hill High School. So we're still out there working for veterans.
I got a question for you.
Sure.
Something we talked about earlier. We got to share this story about you sneaking the guys out of the
yeah.
hospital and getting them to the bar.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about, because it's such a big story because of I think, when we were talking last night, we talked just the backdrop that's going on behind all of this drama or all of the assassinations, the civil rights movement. You just have so many things going on in the country. In the midst of your own personal crisis, you have all these other, forces at work that were having an influence, certainly, on everything. So I left Snow Hill when I was 18, and I moved to Washington, D.C. So I ended up working in a bar to work my way through college. And the gentleman I worked for, Dick Mendelson, was very sympathetic towards the loss that I had already had, and then he was just very sympathetic about Vietnam veterans or Vietnam soldiers in particular. I lived on Wisconsin and 39th Street, and so that was a straight avenue down to Georgetown. And a lot of the protests, many protests were going on then. So I was getting invitations just about every night. Hey, we're going down here. We're having another candlelight vigil or something like that. Would you want to go? And so it was things like that. There were things happening that we sort of lived. You felt like you were living like two lives, sort of. You had this very, very deep personal loss that you had, but you also knew that the war was not going well, that things were not going well. There were senseless deaths, and that we just couldn't end it. We couldn't figure out how to end it. But also, I didn't want somebody down there with Mike's name in their hands, and so I said, no, I don't want you. I'm not going, but I don't want anybody else with his name because you don't know how he felt. And, So anyway, one of the things I ended up doing was a couple soldiers that were in the hospital at Walter Reed up towards Bethesda from me came into the bar. And so we got talking and things like that. And then pretty soon they said, well, we have an idea. We have a lot of guys who can't get out. They can't walk around. We've at least got canes or some way to get around. We can get a cab and get out. And so between myself and the owner of the bar and everything, he said, the bar owner said, we figured out a way that I would take my vehicle, I would go on base or go to the hospital. I would load up my Tempest Pontiac, my old car, with the walking wounded, and then I would take them to the Wits End on Cone Street in Wisconsin, and Dick would feed them and drink them, and they would watch TV, they would listen to the jukebox, they would dance, they were in their pajamas, they were in their bathrobes. I'm sure all this is very illegal to have done.
It's been a long time
And
ago.
then-
They're not going to come looking
No,
for us
no,
now. Yeah.
because that's, you wanted to do something, because
Yeah.
it was such a strange time, and for those, young men, it was a very, very different reality than for what was happening with the protest movement and everything. It was a very difficult time for them, an ungrateful nation, and carrying the burden of the war just on themselves. And so that was just a unique opportunity, I thought, and a way to still be to help somebody maybe.
There was a big difference between the atmosphere, I guess, in Snow Hill and the atmosphere when you got around the cities.
Right.
I won't call it anti-patriotism. I won't say that because I
No.
don't think it was that, but I think it was, people were seeing or thinking more about what was going on. There was more support in the small towns it was tough on the guys coming back.
Right. It was very tough.
It was
Very,
tough
very
on the guys
tough.
coming back.
And very, very strong patriots in the anti-war movement as well. So it was, like I said, you wish that you could feel all the way this way, or you could feel all the way that way. But I think instead it was like a war going on in yourself, because our nation was, so divided. And, traditionally when you send off, in Roman times, when you send off your soldiers to fight the war, everyone comes out in the streets. And the women have the flowers and everybody is praising you. And that's the only way you can go off and do war, is if everyone is behind you. And when they're not, then you bear that on yourself. And I think it's happening today. And I think that's part of the reason that we wanted to do this. This isn't just about us. In this community right now, in the Salisbury and the Wicomico, Somerset and Worcester County area, there are young wives who don't see their husbands, who are off in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere in the world in harm's way. You have parents who have children who are in. It's the same thing. there wasn't a meal that went by that we didn't look at the map of Vietnam over our dining room table, and we listened to Walter Cronkite every night because we knew where he was reporting is where Mike was, particularly, or where Denny was. And so it was just a very, very different time for us, and especially for those men then, and I believe for the young men and the older ones, since they've used reservists so much this time, for the ones that are in their 30s and 40s, I think they're experiencing the same thing. So what I would say is, find one of those families and put your arms around them, and let them know that you understand how tough it must be. If there's something you can do, if you can cut their grass, if you can send them a card, if you can, whatever you can do, they're alone also to some extent. So just to remember that it's still happening. It's just a different place.
Abby, we're going to see some pictures along with this. I understand you've been pretty busy.
I got very inspired to go through. We were terrible photographers, but
Well, the equipment wasn't very good either
that's
back
right,
then. Yeah,
that's right.
So it's a little
But
different
just to
than today.
put together our family story,
Right.
I called it our story. And in doing that, going through not only the pictures Mike and Denny had sent back from Vietnam, but also going through the journals that my parents kept of that was a very emotional, but also very healing experience. Because I was 13 and 15, and going through all the material, I was able to relive it as an adult, and I felt I understood much more my parents. I understood much more myself, and what had really happened to our family. I remember, and it was very intense, but it was a labor of love. And it's amazing that you do get a better understanding when you see it all together as a story. I remember reading my father's journal when they were down at the hospital when Denny was in a coma for that week. And just some of the things he wrote that, why can't I raise a son past 22? So I just felt like I could touch, again, in a deeper way, in an adult way, what had happened and to process it better myself. Because unlike Rhonda and Belva, I was not interested. I was so disillusioned with the government, the lies that had come out of Washington regarding the war. Mike and Denny both were both very committed to the war, but they saw what was going on. I remember Mike wrote in one of his letters, "Our command here is not willing for us to die fighting. They're just willing for us to die at the time when you couldn't shoot unless you were shot at first." And I remember Denny writing that we take this hill today, but tomorrow Charlie will be back, and the next day he'll be back. This is not a war. This is just where people die. And so seeing their own evolution, they were patriotic to the end, but they also began to see the realities of that. And so my response was, as Rhonda was talking about all the cultural revolution going on, I just really became disillusioned with the government. I actually liked Nixon because he did the ceasefire. And my sisters actually, at one point, I think, insisted that I come home and visit the wall, because I didn't really want to even touch that. So going through that photo album helped me a lot to come to terms with what our family and I had experienced.
The wall. That's an interesting. I know I've never been to it, but they brought a replica of it
Yes.
to Salisbury, and your mother was there.
Yes, we were able to take my mother and my father to the wall. We
In
did
Washington,
that
the one
in
in
Washington,
Washington,
D.C.
yeah,
And I remember my first experience there. I went with my husband. We were looking for his best friend on there as well, and Mike, of course. And there was just such a sense of peace there for me, and I really felt like Mike was there in Washington more than he was in Snow Hill in the graveyard. I really felt it was a powerful thing. She did a beautiful job, a young woman.
Is there anything anybody would like to say before we close it up? Wrap it up?
It's a big story. It's hard to get it all
Yeah,
in, but
oh,
I really appreciate.
It's been wonderful talking to you folks. I mean, it's there's so many stories out there, you know, and young people need to hear them.
Yeah.
They need to hear them.
Yeah.
You know, if there's any lessons that's been learned, especially from the Vietnam War, like you were talking about, you know, the things that weren't done, whatever, and the reasons. Maybe there was lessons to be learned for, unfortunately, if we have future conflicts, that they won't be run quite that way.
We hope
We don't
not.
want to get too much into politics here. That's not really what this is all about. But so thank you all for coming
Thank
in.
you very
Appreciate
much.
it.
Thank you, Joe.
Appreciate it.
It's
Yeah.
our
Thank you for joining us for Eastern Shore Veterans. I'm Joe Holloway. If you have a story to tell about your military service or know someone that does, contact us here at PAC 14. Thank you.